Hello there my RPG lovers and welcome to another video. After Piranha Bytes finished the work on Risen Trilogy, I was really excited to see what they plan to do next. A lot of people were expecting to see another Gothic as their next game because it seemed like the perfect time for that to happen. When they announced a brand new IP, I must admit I was kinda disappointed but definitely curious. I have a huge passion for open world RPGs, as you can probably tell if you're watching my videos. And Elex turned out to be one of the first games that I covered in depth on my channel back in 2017. Even though this game definitely had some problems that we're going to address in this video, I think it offers a pretty solid experience all around. With the sequel right behind the corner, I think now is a great time to revisit the first game for another playthrough, or maybe to try it out for the first time ever. This video should be a good reminder of what kind of experience you can expect to have while playing this game. I will cover everything that I consider important without any major spoilers, so you don't have to worry about that if you're a new player. Anyway, let's start from the beginning. Piranha Bytes games have always been beginner unfriendly and Elex is no different. There are a lot of things that can cause frustration to the player, especially in the early game. However, most of these things are deliberate design decisions, which are poorly explained to the player. In the very beginning of the game, it's always a bad idea to pick a fight with everything that exists basically. The difficulty you choose is not really a huge factor when it comes to this. You will probably have a lot of problems in fights in the early game, even on the easiest difficulty. Now, the main critique for Elex and pretty much every game from this studio has always been the janky combat system. And indeed, the combat is definitely janky and it has some problems that we'll discuss a bit later. However, I don't think it's nearly as bad as some people make it out to be. These are just my personal impressions, but I think some people have bigger problems with the core progression system of the game rather than the combat itself. To put this into perspective, even if Elex had one of the best third-person action combat mechanics, like in Monster Hunter games, Dragon's Dogma or even Dark Souls, that wouldn't change the core philosophy of the progression. You would still have to run from most enemies in the beginning until you level up and get some better gear. It's just how the progression system works, it's nothing new when it comes to Piranha Bytes games. So it's not a pure skill-based system, even though it's not impossible to kill everything with your starting weapon by just learning how the mechanics work. Nevertheless, you probably shouldn't try to play like that on your first playthrough at least. That being said, the combat itself could definitely be a lot better, and we're going to discuss that a bit later. This studio always had the same philosophy in all their games: your character is really weak in the beginning. It's not exactly a unique concept, in all RPGs you start as a weak character, but Piranha Bytes games are really extreme when it comes to this. This makes the character progression feel really good and it's easily one of the best things about their games. Even a very small upgrade to your character skill or gear is very noticeable. In Elex you play as Jax, the ex-commander of the Alps, one of the 4 major factions in the game. Your brother tried to kill you, but you just barely survived. Alps are using the element Elex as a performance-enhancing drug basically, so when Jax woke up, Elex left his system, leaving him a lot weaker. That should be more than enough to make you think twice before you attack anything stronger than a mass rat. After a short linear section of the game, which is basically a tutorial area, the game opens up completely and you are free to do whatever you want. In theory. What you should do before that is follow Duras to Goliath, which is one of the major cities in the game. This is also part of the beginning tutorial, even though it's a bit more subtle. You can skip it if you want to, but I would really recommend doing that if you're a new player. Mainly because Duras can give you some pretty useful tips about the world, and he will help you fight everything along the way. The game tries to show you that you will always have decisions to make with real gameplay consequences. Although I'm not a huge fan of the text that constantly pops out when you make some decisions, but we'll talk about that later. As soon as you get your jetpack in the tutorial area and meet Duras, the world of Elex, or Magalan as they call it, completely opens up. It's a true open world game with no compromises or loading screens. While this is not exactly impressive for today's standards, it's definitely worth mentioning. Piranha Bytes have a rich history when it comes to this. They released Gothic 3 in 2006 and that game had a huge open world as well, with no loading screens. Immersing yourself in the game world was always one of the top priorities in their games. So in order to achieve that, you want to have the least amount of things which artificially interrupts your gameplay. Not to mention that loading a specific instance area feels totally disconnected from the open world. Anyway, like I said, the world of Magellan is completely open right from the start. However, it's not really smart to immediately start exploring everything. I always thought that the sense of danger in the world is really important to get right in these types of games, and the world of Elex definitely has that. But that wouldn't matter much if the world itself is not interesting to explore. You will probably feel very tempted to explore every corner of this map, but once you learn how dangerous it can be, you will think twice before you do that in the future. That's also one of the things that makes the exploration feel rewarding. This is probably a good time to mention that there is no level scaling in Elex. All monsters and human NPCs have fixed levels right from the beginning. You can't exactly see the level of enemy you're fighting, but you should pay attention to their names. It's something that Piranha Bytes has been doing ever since the first Gothic game. A lot of NPCs have a weaker version of themselves, which you can only tell by their name. So, for example, a young jackal is much weaker than the regular jackal, old Skax is a lot weaker than the regular Skax, and so on. The game really makes you pay attention to these kinds of things and carefully pick your fights. Oh yeah, and if you see a skull icon besides the name, it's usually not even worth trying to fight that enemy, unless you are try-hard like me. I think that most of new players learn this the hard way, which is exactly what the game wants. It expects you to learn how the world works and adapt by yourself however you can. If you say that a lot of these features are poorly explained, you would be right. But the line between no hand-holding and poorly explained features is very thin. So I think it all comes down to what you prefer. Either way, this will be a cause of frustration in some cases. Allowing the player to adapt to the world by himself is great, as long as the game offers you a decent amount of different options to do so, both narratively and gameplay-wise. And Elex is pretty strong on both of those fields, even though a lot of gameplay options suffer from poor balancing and some exploitable mechanics. But let's talk about the narrative aspect of the game first.
It didn't take long for people to form groups to get resources. And it didn't take long for those people to start fighting. All factions think they've got ways to save us. They're all just ways people are trying to survive.
This is not exactly a conventional post-apocalyptic setting, and that kinda makes it more interesting and unique in a way. The comet has struck the planet 160 years ago and brought the element called Elex. The people who survived started forming different factions, and they also discovered how useful this new alien element can be. All four factions are using Elex in a different way. The Berserkers are transmuting it into mana, the Clerics use it for their machines and weapons, Outlaws use it for drugs, and Alps are injecting Elex to enhance their abilities. There are a lot more nuance to that, of course, but that's all that you should know in the beginning. Since the player has the highest chance to interact with the Berserkers first, let's talk about them for a second.
Oh, and don't steal anything, or flash technology around. I don't expect any more or less from you.
The ideology of Berserkers is to refuse all forms of technology, which seems really stupid because it is. They also refuse to use Elex in any other way, except transmuting it into pure mana, which allows them to use magic. Transforming Elex into mana by using the nature seems like a good idea, but refusing to use any form of Elex-based technology just doesn't make any sense. Using bows and primitive medieval weapons versus laser guns and huge robots is dumb. However, the ability to use magic on top of that makes it a bit less stupid if we think of that as their main source of power. A lot of people who played the game seem to think of Berserkers as a really dumb faction because of their Amish-like lifestyle.
Stop messing around with that technology, will you?
You edgy bitch!
But what about other factions? How about clerics that have robots and futuristic weaponry, yet they are religious fanatics? Or the Alps, which are basically addicted to Elex, incapable of any emotional thinking? All factions have some parts that might not seem that realistic. At the end of the day, it's a fantasy setting. However, the majority of people in all factions are behaving exactly how you would expect them to behave in that situation. That's another thing that Piranha Bytes has been doing really well ever since the first Gothic game. All factions are fairly interesting and they have a decent amount of lore. Speaking of lore, you will find a lot of audio logs about the happenings before the comet struck the planets, and a ton of written notes as well. not to mention the environmental storytelling behind every corner of the map. When it comes to the main character, Jax was a former ARB commander, but once Elex was finally out of his system, he basically became one of the free people. The quote-unquote free people is a phrase that ARBs use to describe everyone outside of their faction. That should tell you more than enough about these guys. So you as the player have the option to join one of the three major factions, even though you have a big history with the ARBs. One really important thing that you should know before you start playing this game is that completing quests is your biggest source for gaining experience. It's not even comparable to experience you get from killing things in the game. Completing the quest is one thing, but you can also get XP in various dialogue situations, and the game doesn't exactly tell you this. So if you want to maximize your XP gain, talk to every named NPC that's not hostile. You can try talking to hostile NPCs as well, but they usually don't listen. Anyway, there is a ton of dialogue in the game, and all of it is voice acted. It's quite impressive for a AA RPG standards. The quality of voice acting is also pretty good all around. Not perfect or amazing, but I think it's a big improvement compared to their older games and, like I said, just AA RPGs in general.
Speak to the people here, and they can tell you where your skills are best used.
The only AA RPG that has better voice acting that came out in recent years was Greedfall, although the number of NPCs in that game is much lower compared to Elex. The first time I played this game, I wasn't exactly a fan of Jack's voice, and saying that for the main character of the game that you're going to listen a lot is not a good thing. However, the way that Jack speaks actually makes a lot of sense from the lore perspective. After all, he's dealing with a new wave of emotions which he couldn't feel before.
If Calyx had seen I was still alive, he would have finished the job.
Not long after you start interacting with NPCs in Goliath, your quest log will fill up. And throughout the game, it will constantly be full of quests that you can do. To the point where it can be a bit confusing because a lot of quests are branching into different quests, even those for the main story. While you're trying to do a specific quest, you will almost for sure get another one that extends the branch of your current quest. But more importantly, the quality of quests is really good. I would really like to see more RPGs with a similar quest design because even fetch quests can be pretty interesting in this game. The term fetch quest has a really bad reputation and it's usually associated with very bad quest design. You get an extremely shallow quest description, usually to go and pick something up and that's it. Elex definitely has those kinds of quests, but what makes them a lot better than your standard fetch quest is a couple of things actually. First of all, the writing for most of those quests is not bad at all, and there are some proper consequences for your actions, even though this is the simplest form of quests that you can get in RPGs. For example, all factions have quests that you will need to do in order to join them, and how you choose to do them is equally important. So they almost never feel like they're just wasting your time for no reason. In order to give you a clear example of this, I'll quickly mention one of the first quests that you can get right after you decide to follow Duras to Goliath. You will find some cleric weapons in this building. Duras warns you that berserkers are not tolerating that kind of technology in Goliath and that you should probably report your findings when you get there. But he also tells you that's your decision. Right after you arrive in Goliath, the berserker called Betram will ask you if you heard anything about the cleric weapons that someone brought in the city. So you will have the option to sell those weapons to this guy or keep them and report what you found to berserkers. Selling the weapons will get you a lot of Elexit, which is the currency in this game. And he can also give you some useful tips if you plan to be a cleric and learn more about technology, which is kinda weird because you just arrived in the main city of berserkers. But it goes to show you that not all people are blindly following the rules of their faction. This is the case with all factions in the game except ARBs, I guess. But even they have groups of separatists that are not immediately hostile to other factions and the player. Anyway, if you decide to sell those cleric weapons, it will slightly affect your chances to join the berserkers. This quest obviously serves to show the player what he can expect from other similar quests in the game. It's part of the tutorial, even though the game doesn't tell you this. When it comes to the main quests, I never actually felt like the game has that false sense of urgency. Except a couple of times I guess, but it's not nearly as bad as in some other open world RPGs. You are never pressured to do anything. It's not like, oh, the world is in great danger, you need to hurry up and do the main quests. That's what I'm trying to say. A lot of quests in the game are really flexible and you usually have at least a couple of ways to complete them. There is a decent amount of really complex quests in the game with a lot of thought put into them. And most of them are optional, like companion quests. All 7 companions in the game have their personal quest chain that you can do. I highly recommend doing the quest chain for Duress, because it's basically a big murder investigation and it's really good in general. Same goes for Arx and Ray. But of course, you can choose to do them all if you want to, like you probably should. Speaking of companions, they all have unique dialogue lines with pretty much everyone that you can interact with. They will spit their ideas and ideologies in the middle of your dialogue with NPCs.
He's right. The clerics are plotting something and we need to put our foot right through whatever the fuck it is.
This isn't your decision.
You really shouldn't talk to Nasty like that. Now am I getting my information or what?
You certainly won't get to experience every possible dialogue situation in just one playthrough. Not just when it comes to dialogue, the game has a high replay value in general because of the 3 different factions. No matter which faction you join, you will miss out on a lot of quests from other factions. What I found particularly impressive when it comes to dialogue system is how it handles your choice of faction. Now look, you can invest a lot of hours in the game without joining any faction. You can go around the world and do a lot of quests for everyone without the need for joining a faction. Or you can rush to join your desirable faction by doing specific quests for them. Either way, NPCs will treat you differently. Sometimes it's just an extra line of dialogue acknowledging your faction choice.
You want a cleric's help?
I don't care what faction or what god you believe in. The only true friend is profit. And if you're not here for Kalan, that means you must be here for your own benefit, right?
And sometimes it will actually affect the gameplay. It's a very flexible and realistic way of handling the dialogue system and it's pretty immersive. But unfortunately, playing for a long time without joining a faction is not handled really well in the game from the gameplay perspective. Simply because you get a really big power boost when you join a faction. This is especially noticeable on difficult and ultra difficulty. I played through the game multiple times on difficult and ultra difficulty, so I can't really speak about other difficulties. What I can tell you is that ultra difficulty is really bad. Not because it's extremely difficult or anything like that, but it's just not balanced properly. The health bar on all enemies is bloated as hell and you will have to endure a lot of bullshit until you actually start doing some damage to enemies. I recommend sticking with the default difficulty for your first playthrough. If you find it really hard to progress, there is nothing wrong with playing on easy, or maybe push it to difficult if it's not challenging enough. Either way, you should avoid ultra difficulty at all costs. By the way, you can manually customize the difficulty options regardless of the difficulty itself. I recommend lowering the combat behavior of NPCs if you have a lot of problems in fights. But I'll also give you some proper tips when it comes to combat in our next segment of the video. But hey, even if the combat is still bad for you, it's probably not as bad as your sex life. So stop complaining. That being said, I would really like to see just one global difficulty for the game, because I think that's always a better choice. I got carried away a little bit. The thing I forgot to mention when it comes to dialogue is the cold system. And it's actually pretty important because throughout the whole game, your cold level will go up and down, depending on how you respond in dialogues.
She deserved to die. I did you a favor.
You can't just kill our people.
She was that important to you?
Now you should know that this will affect the ending, as well as some important quests in the game. It's basically like a dialogue check in other RPGs, but you also have other skill checks in dialogue, so there's that as well. My problem with the cold system comes from the dialogue itself, because there are a lot of situations where I couldn't actually tell if my cold level will go up or down. It just didn't make much sense to me in some dialogue situations. So if you plan to control your cold level in all dialogue situations, you might be surprised with the outcome. Anyway, let's start talking about the gameplay. Since I already talked a lot about the combat system, let's just continue with that. Like I said, the melee combat in this game is not really good, but it's also not as bad as some people think. Some parts of the melee combat are really unpolished, like the hitboxes. I think the main problem when it comes to this is how ambitious Piranha Bytes was trying to be with all the enemy types. Elex has a really decent amount of different enemy types with unique attack animations. Sure, there are some reskins of the same enemy, but still, the amount of different enemy types is impressive. Unfortunately, that's also the problem because it was just too much to handle properly by a studio with 30 people. They could basically cut the amount of enemy types in half and try to polish their hitboxes and just make the experience of fighting them a lot better. But it is what it is. The problem with learning how the mechanics work is the inconsistency of the melee combat itself. What I mean by that is mostly related to dodging and evading hits. You can learn how to properly dodge human NPC attacks, but if you apply the same rules to some monster NPCs, you will fail. That's because the rule for dodging and evading human attacks is to press the button well after their attack animation starts. If you try to dodge right after the enemy started the attack animation, you will always get hit, even if you seem to be far away. You can apply the same rule for a lot of monster attacks as well, but their unique attacks are the problem because they just don't give a crap about this rule. And on top of that, there are some pretty bad twitchy attacks that don't give you enough time to react, and some of them are just poorly telegraphed. So it's pretty obvious why the melee combat in this game can cause so much frustration. The stamina system is another unfinished feature in the game, at least when it comes to NPC stamina. I suggest lowering the stamina cost of your attacks in the difficulty menu or even turning it off completely. Even though NPCs have stamina meters, they don't seem to follow the same rule as the player, so I don't see the reason why you shouldn't turn it off, to be honest. On the bright side, Elex gives you a lot of different tools to kill your enemies. You have one-handed and two-handed melee weapons, bows, bombs, laser and plasma rifles, flamethrowers, crossbows, and of course, magic. Unique abilities are locked behind factions, but you can find a lot of one-use items in the world which function the same as those abilities, especially when it comes to cleric abilities. So yeah, you definitely have a lot of items that you can use in combat. However, there is another important mechanic that is handled poorly in the game, and that's the stun lock mechanic. The reason why it's bad is because it basically encourages the player to try and cheese every fight when he gets the chance. Some ranged weapons like the flamethrower, the plasma rifle blast mode, and the black hole ability can inflict endless stun lock to basically all enemies. The only thing stopping you from spamming those attacks is your ammunition or your mental energy reserve. And it's actually pretty expensive to try and keep up with your ammo and mental energy drinks or mana drinks if you're a berserker. You will also need more Elexit if you plan to buy ammo or drinks on a regular basis. But even though these attacks can cause stun lock, they are not really great when it comes to damage, except the black hole ability, I guess. This of course depends on your difficulty setting, but on difficult and ultra, it's not exactly the best way to deal the most damage. It's definitely really effective and the safest way to deal with enemies, but it's not that sustainable, especially in early to mid game. Mainly because you will need a lot of Elexit. I don't think that melee attacks are that inferior to ranged stun lock attacks, but I understand why a lot of people just choose to ignore melee weapons for the reasons I mentioned above. However, if you want to get into a melee playstyle, using a one-handed weapon and a shield is what you should try to do first. That's because the shield is almost equally impactful at stun locking, and of course you can effectively block the full damage. Shield bashing has almost 100% chance to send your enemy on the ground, or at least stagger them for a second, giving you the chance to strike them a few times. And the special attack with your shield gives you a 100% chance to stun your enemies. So once you get a bit more comfortable with a melee combat like this, you can try and start using two-handed weapons if you want to, of course. They deal really good damage and they can also effectively stun multiple enemies at once. So I don't think the melee weapons are that inferior to ranged weapons, but they are definitely harder to get used to. The combo system is another reason for that. In order to chain your melee attacks properly, you need to press the attack button again when the animation ends. It's actually not that hard when you get used to it and you have a meter which can help you with that. Every melee weapon type has a special attack which can be performed after you chain a couple of attacks in a combo. They are worth using, but you shouldn't force them because they can easily get you hit. So I think it's always better to focus on a couple of attacks and prepare to defend yourself by dodging, evading or blocking. That depends on the situation obviously. I think there was a really simple way to improve the combo system a bit by just increasing the damage you deal with each successful combo hit. I know they definitely have more stun damage, but I'm talking about the actual damage you deal. Although the difficulty settings are customizable, so you can probably achieve a similar effect by messing with the damage dealt. No matter what your level is, you will have a lot of challenging fights in the game. These high level NPCs are not exclusive to one zone or anything like that. Each biome in the game has weak and strong enemies that you're going to stumble upon while exploring. The best way of dealing with really strong enemies is to come back later when you start doing some noticeable damage to their health pool. There are a couple of boss fights as well, but they're almost not worth mentioning because they're really bad. I really hope that improves in Elex 2. We could talk about the combat all day, and I maybe even do a separate video about it. But we also must mention some other gameplay features. Like I already mentioned, exploring the world is just amazing for a couple of reasons. Saying that the world is handcrafted won't mean much until you actually feel that while exploring. 90% of the time your jetpack has just enough fuel to land where you want to go, and that's one of the biggest proofs that all of these assets are placed by hands. At first, it might seem like a coincidence, but after you do it for hundreds of times, it becomes obvious they put a lot of thought in designing the world to work with the jetpack. And areas themselves are interesting to explore, which is a lot more important. 5 different biomes in the game offer a lot of diverse terrain to explore, and you can find something interesting behind every corner. Like I said, you have to play it for yourself to feel the meaning of handcrafted worlds. I think the game is worth playing for this reason alone. I'm pretty sure I don't have anything bad to say about the world design and exploration. There are quest marks though, which I'm not a huge fan of. But there are also a lot of quests which don't involve the player mindlessly following the quest mark. Instead of a mini-map, the game has a simple radar. And I always prefer that over a detailed minimap that draws your attention away from exploring the map. When it comes to some other gameplay features like crafting, I'm not a huge fan of how it's handled in Elex. You can upgrade your weapons if you have the skill, or craft some rings, gems or amulets. It's not bad, but I think it could be a lot better. I love crafting systems in RPGs, although I don't think we're ever going to see a really deep crafting system in Piranha Bytes games. Simply because it has the chance to make the progression unbalanced, especially if we could be able to craft armor sets. But that doesn't mean the crafting couldn't be improved in Elex 2. Itemization on the other hand is pretty solid. Getting a better armor in Piranha Bytes games is a really important thing, and it's not as simple as just buying it or crafting it yourself. Some people won't prefer that, but it's one of the staples of Piranha Bytes RPGs, and I think it works great. All factions have 3 different sets of armors that you will get by progressing through the story. It's not simple as that though, because you will actually need to buy them and they're not cheap at all. It feels really rewarding when you manage to get them, which makes the sense of progression great. You can argue that the number of armor sets is really low, and you would be right, but I don't see that as a problem in their games because that's how it always worked. Actually, I would like to see something similar in other RPGs, although I doubt that will ever happen. There is a level requirement for progressing with your faction, so even though you do all the required quests, you will still need a couple of more levels in order to progress, which basically makes it impossible to do only main quests and rush through the game. With each new rank you get in your faction, you unlock new equipment. Unlocking new abilities from your faction depends on your stat distribution. The stats sheet is not really handled well in Elex because they just feel like the requirement for unlocking new abilities and weapons. However, they mentioned that Elex 2 improved on this field a lot, and I truly hope that's the case. I recommend waiting a bit before you start using your stat points. Check out some abilities and weapons that seem interesting to you and then start investing your points. Legendary weapons that you can find all over the world require a lot of stat points, even though they don't actually do the most damage. Your fully upgraded weapons from basically all factions will do a lot more damage than legendary weapons, but I still like using them. Especially those that you can use even on lower levels like the Snakebite and Ignis artifacts. Even though their base damage is not great, the elemental effect on them is really effective, especially for hit and run tactics. When it comes to the replay value of the game, it's obviously really high. The game itself is pretty long, you will need around 50 or 60 hours to finish the main story, but this will depend on how you play. You can easily spend around 100 hours if you plan to do everything you can. And nothing is stopping you from picking another faction and replaying the game. I just realized I haven't mentioned anything about the graphics, so let's go quickly over that. The game aged pretty good actually. I think they managed to strike a good balance between cartoony and realistic style, especially when it comes to character models. The environments are still looking great, although you will find some rough textures here and there. But that's not nearly enough to make the game look bad or anything close to that. The art style in general is much better compared to recent games, in my opinion at least. I'm playing on the highest settings and the performance never seemed to be the issue for me. You can see my PC specs on the screen. Anyway guys, we have to draw the line somewhere. I think I said enough about Elex and why you should consider playing it before Elex 2 comes out. Elex is far from being perfect and it's a bit too ambitious for such a small team, but there's a lot to like about it. If you can tolerate some unpolished features, not so great melee combat and a little bit of Jank.
For Eurojank. Eurojank?
Yeah, that somehow became a meme. I tried my best to explain every good and bad thing about the game, but I probably missed something because the game is huge. Feel free to leave a comment with your thoughts about the game. Did you love it, hate it, or you never played it before? If you're interested in Elex 2, I will be covering the game when it comes out, so be sure to stick around. And if you're new to my channel, I cover a lot of RPGs and I also talk about mechanics and RPG features in my videos. Don't forget to subscribe for more RPG content. If you want to support the channel in the long run, consider becoming a Patreon or a YouTube member. You can get your name on the end credits as well as some other perks like early access to videos, Discord roles, my plans for future content, etc. etc. That will be all, and I'll see you in the next one.